Some families teach you that love is unconditional. Mine taught me that love has a price, and that I was always the one expected to pay it. What happens when the person who truly saw you is lying in a hospice bed, and the people who were supposed to protect you are busy erasing everything she ever promised? My name is Caroline Hayes. I am 29 years old, and on paper, my life looks simple. I teach music at an elementary school in Boston, 40 kids who still mix up quarter notes and half notes, a classroom that smells like pencil shavings and old sheet music, and an apartment so small that my second-hand upright piano takes up an entire wall. I do not own much, but for most of my life I convinced myself that quiet was enough. That I was enough. My father, Edward Hayes, built a real estate firm from nothing through the kind of relentless ambition that leaves very little room for anything soft. My mother, Patricia, runs a boutique clothing store in Boston's Back Bay, the kind of place with no price tags in the window, because the people shopping there already know they can afford it. My younger sister, Sophia, is everything my parents wanted in a daughter: polished, confident, and for the past 8 months, dating Ryan Clifford, the only son of my father's most valuable business partner. In the story my family told about itself, Sophia was the leading role. I was background noise. The one person who never made me feel that way was my grandmother, Margaret Hayes. At 78 years old, she had lived more fully than most people dare to imagine. She had performed at Carnegie Hall in her prime, back when her name carried genuine weight in the classical music world. She was the woman who sat beside me on a piano bench when I was 7, guiding my small, uncertain fingers across the keys of her 1905 Bosendorfer, a dark, beautiful instrument that had stood in the living room of her home in Concord, Massachusetts for as long as I had been alive. That piano was not furniture. It was the first place I ever felt like I belonged somewhere. 3 weeks ago, my parents sold it for $112,000. No warning, no permission. They took the money and bought Sophia a brand new Range Rover Sport. Red bow on the hood, keys handed over like a trophy. My grandmother was lying in a hospice bed when it happened. They assumed she was too fragile to find out. They assumed I was too conditioned to say a word. They were wrong about both, because 7 words my grandmother spoke quietly into a phone would unravel everything my parents thought they had built. The call came on a Tuesday, mid-lesson, my father's name on the screen. No greeting when I picked up, no softness, just, Mom had another heart episode. Family meeting at the hospital, 5 o'clock, don't be late. By the time I arrived, he, my mother, and Sophia were already clustered in the corner of the waiting room, speaking in low, efficient voices. The voices of people who are managing something, rather than feeling it. My father glanced up just long enough to say, "Someone has to visit Mom every day. Caroline, your schedule is the most flexible. You'll take care of it." I pressed down everything that rose in my chest and said, "Of course, I want to be with her." As I walked down the hallway toward her room, I caught my mother's voice drifting behind me, casual and careless, aimed at Sophia, and no one else. At least she's good for something. I kept walking. I did not turn around, not because I hadn't heard, but because I had been hearing versions of that sentence my entire life, and somewhere along the way it had stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like the weather, something you simply lived inside of, without questioning whether it had to be that way. That was the last time I accepted it without question. Grandmother Margaret's hospice room smelled like lavender and old books, and she intended to keep it that way. The first time a nurse came in with a bottle of antiseptic spray, Grandmother waved her off with a thin but steady hand. "If I'm going to die," she said, "I'm going to die surrounded by things I love, not chemicals." The nurse didn't argue. Nobody argued with Margaret Hayes when she used that tone. Every afternoon after my last class, I drove straight to the hospice. I'd pull a chair close to her bed, take her hand, and just talk. About my students, about the little boy who couldn't read a single note yet, but kept perfect time by nodding his whole body to the beat. She would laugh at that, a soft sound that cost her something, but came out genuine. Those hours were the quietest, steadiest part of my day. The rest of my life felt like standing on ice. That room felt like solid ground. One evening, as the winter light faded outside her window, Grandmother reached over and took my hand with both of hers. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "The Bosendorfer," she said, letting the words settle between us. "My piano. The 1905. I want you to have it, Caroline. I've already told your father and your mother. Said it in front of the whole family, so there'd be no confusion." I remembered that moment clearly. My father's jaw had gone tight. My mother had exchanged a quick look with Sophia, and Sophia had sighed and muttered something under her breath about that old thing. Grandmother tightened her grip on my hand and said, "You're the only one who understands what it means. Promise me you'll take care of it." I looked at her and said, "I promise, Grandma." She nodded once, like that was settled, like the world could move on now. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I went to her house in Concord to pick up a box of old photographs she'd asked me to bring. I still had a key. I let myself in through the front door, walked down the hallway, and stepped into the living room, and stopped breathing. The corner where the Bosendorfer had stood for decades was empty, not rearranged, not moved to another wall. Empty. All that remained was a rectangular depression pressed into the carpet, deep and deliberate, like a wound that hadn't closed yet. My hands started shaking before I even reached for my phone. When my mother picked up, I kept my voice as level as I could. "Mom, where is Grandma's piano?" There was a pause, not a surprised pause, but a calculated one. Then she said, "Your father handled it. It's an adult matter, Caroline," and hung up. I drove to my parents' house without thinking, running on something between panic and rage. My father answered the door with a glass of scotch in his hand, looking mildly inconvenienced. "We sold it," he said, before I could even finish the question. "Got $112,000 for it. Good price." The world tilted. I steadied myself against the doorframe, and then from somewhere behind him came the bright jingle of car keys, and Sophia appeared at the top of the stairs, glowing, holding up a key fob like a trophy. "Can you believe it?" she said. I looked at my father. "You bought Sophia a car, with Grandma's piano." He shrugged the way people shrug when they're discussing the weather. "Sophia needs to make the right impression on the Clifford family. Ryan's father pays attention to these things." My mother stepped in behind him, arms folded. "You teach children's music lessons, Caroline. You don't perform. You don't even have room for an instrument that size. What exactly were you planning to do with it?" I took a slow breath and asked the only question that mattered. "Does Grandma know?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Then my mother stepped closer, dropped her voice to something cold and deliberate, and said, "If you tell her, and the shock causes something to happen, that is on you. Are you prepared to live with that?" I looked her in the eye. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I did not look away. Then I turned around and walked out without a word. That night, I didn't sleep, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, I made the decision that changed everything. I sat on my second-hand couch until well past midnight, knees pulled to my chest, staring at a framed photograph on the bookshelf across the room. It was my grandmother at her final public performance, 20 years ago, fingers poised above the keys of the Bosendorfer, her expression lit from within by something that had nothing to do with the stage lights. She looked like a woman who knew exactly who she was. I had spent 29 years trying to figure out the same thing. My mother's words kept circling back, low and relentless. "If something happens to her, that is on you." I turned the thread over in my mind, the way you press on a bruise, not because it feels good, but because you need to know how deep the damage goes. And then I remembered something my grandmother told me when I was 12 years old. I had failed a math test and was terrified to tell my parents, and she sat down beside me at the kitchen table and said, "Caroline, the truth can hurt, but a lie always hurts worse. It just takes longer to show up." I had carried that sentence for 17 years without fully understanding it. Sitting there at 3 in the morning, in the silence of my apartment, I finally did. 29 years of making myself smaller. 29 years of accepting the leftover version of things, of love, of recognition, of space in my own family. And for what? I set down the photograph, turned off the lamp, and made my decision in the dark. My grandmother deserved to know the truth, and I was going to be the one to tell her. I arrived at the hospice before sunrise, before my first class, while the hallways were still quiet and the morning light was just beginning to press through the curtains. Grandmother was awake, propped against her pillows, watching the pale winter sky through the window. She looked at me the moment I walked in and said, "You look like you haven't slept." I pulled the chair close to her bed and said, "I haven't, Grandma." Then I told her everything. The empty corner, the rectangular depression in the carpet, the $112,000, the Range Rover with the red bow, my mother's voice dropping low in the doorway, telling me her death would be my fault if I said a word. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. When I finished, the room was very still. My grandmother didn't cry. She didn't gasp or reach for my hand in alarm. She simply exhaled. One long, slow breath. The kind that belongs to someone who has been waiting for a particular shoe to drop for a very long time. Then she said, quietly and without bitterness, "I knew this might happen, sweetheart. I know, my son." Before I could respond, she reached for the phone on her bedside table with a steadiness that surprised me. She scrolled through her contacts, pressed a name, and set the phone on speaker between us. 3 rings. Then a man's voice, low and measured, came through. "Margaret, how are you feeling?" My grandmother looked at me with calm, clear eyes and said, "I'm dying, Walter, but my mind is sharp." She paused for just a moment, and then she said 7 words that I would replay in my head for weeks afterward. "It's time. Sunday, my house. Be ready." The man on the other end answered without hesitation. "Understood. Everything will be in order." Then the line went quiet. I stared at my grandmother. "You have your own attorney?" She set the phone down and, for the first time in days, smiled. A small, knowing smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I have many things your father doesn't know about, Caroline. That has always been his greatest weakness. Edward assumes he understands everything. He never bothered to check." 2 days later, I sat across from Walter Grayson in his office in Salem, Massachusetts. A man in his early 60s, with silver-streaked hair, gold-rimmed glasses, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that smelled like old leather and legal history. He folded his hands on the desk and asked me, "Do you know who actually owns the house in Concord?" I said, "My parents. Grandma transferred it to them after my grandfather passed." Walter slid a single document across the desk without a word. I looked down at it. The name printed on the property deed was Margaret Eleanor Hayes. No transfer, no amendment, nothing. Walter said, "Your parents have been living in that house for 11 years without owning a single square foot of it." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the ground shift beneath everything I thought I understood. That night I went through a box of keepsakes my grandmother had given me years ago. Pressed flowers, old concert programs, faded letters. Near the bottom I found a yellowed envelope with my name written on the front in her handwriting. "For Caroline, when you need to understand." Inside was a copy of a legal document dated 5 years back and a small note card clipped to the corner. In her hand she had written, "This house never left my hands. It was only borrowed, and some people do not deserve the privilege of borrowing." I read it twice. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling and understood, for the first time, exactly what Sunday was going to mean. Sunday came the way significant days often do, quietly, without warning, dressed in ordinary light. I know what was waiting on the other side of that morning, but standing in front of my mirror on Saturday night, all I felt was a low, persistent dread settling in my chest like cold water. The phone rang just after 9, the hospice number. I picked up and heard my grandmother's voice, thin now, worn down to something close to a whisper, but every single word landing with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about each one. "Are you afraid?" she asked. I said, "Yes, Grandma, I am." There was a brief pause, and then she said, "Good. A person who isn't afraid doesn't understand what's actually at stake." She spoke slowly, choosing her words the way she used to choose her tempo at the piano, deliberately, without rushing. "Your father announced the sale of that piano in front of the whole family like it was his decision to make, like I wasn't even in the room, like my wishes were a minor inconvenience." She stopped to breathe, then continued, "So the lesson needs witnesses too." I started to say something about her having more time, More years, and she let the silence after my words sit long enough that I understood what it meant. Then she said, "Do you trust me, Caroline?" I said, "Always, without question." Her voice softened. "Then wear something that makes you feel like yourself. And remember, you are not the villain in this story. You have never been the villain." I set the phone down and looked at my own reflection for a long moment. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not look away. Sunday morning arrived pale and sharp, the kind of winter light that has no warmth in it, only clarity. I drove to Concord in my grandmother's navy dress and the pearl earrings she had given me on my 21st birthday. Small things, but they steadied me. The house was already full when I arrived, 35 people filling the rooms with noise and laughter and the smell of catered food. A banner across the front porch read, "Happy 60th Patricia," in gold lettering. I walked through the front door, and my eyes went immediately to the living room corner, where the Bosendorfer had stood for as long as I had been alive. Someone had placed a large potted plant there, full, green, carefully chosen. It looked exactly like what it was, an attempt to fill a space that couldn't be filled. Across the room, seated quietly near the back wall, with a leather briefcase beside his chair, was Walter Grayson. He caught my eye and gave one small, composed nod. I nodded back. My father called for everyone's attention about an hour into the party, tapping his glass until the room went quiet. He guided the crowd outside to the driveway, where a silver Range Rover Sport sat gleaming in the winter sun, a red bow centered on the hood. "A gift," my father announced, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a man accustomed to commanding a room, made possible by the generosity of grandmother Margaret, who wanted to invest in her granddaughter's future. Sophia shrieked and threw her arms around him, already reaching for the key. People applauded. Someone took photos. I stood near the edge of the crowd and heard Aunt Ruth beside me, her voice tight and low. Margaret actually agreed to this? Before I could answer, Sophia spotted me. She called out across the driveway with a wide smile, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Come take a picture, Caroline. Don't be jealous. I'm sure Grandma left you some of her old sheet music." A few people laughed. I stood still, kept my face even, and did not bow my head. As the crowd filtered back inside, Aunt Ruth stepped directly into my father's path. "Edward," she said, in a voice that stopped him cold. "Did you ask Margaret before you sold that piano?" My father's smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Mom is in hospice, Ruth. She's not in a position to make these kinds of decisions." Ruth didn't move. "I spoke with her this morning. She is completely lucid. And she told me you never asked, not once." The conversation closest to them faltered and died. Mr. Clifford, standing near the fireplace, turned his head slightly. Ryan took a quiet half-step away from Sophia. My mother pushed forward, her voice sharp with the particular edge of someone trying to regain control. "Ruth, today is my birthday." And Ruth said calmly and without raising her voice, "Yes, and your husband just used a dying woman's most treasured possession to buy a luxury vehicle for your younger daughter in front of 35 people. If anyone is making a scene here, it isn't me." The room had gone nearly silent when Walter Grayson rose from his chair. He moved without urgency, crossing the room slowly, and came to a stop in the center of the living room, directly in front of the potted plant, directly where the Bosendorfer used to stand. The placement was not accidental. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silence. "My name is Walter Grayson. I've served as Margaret Hayes's attorney for the past 30 years. My father's face had gone the color of old paper. "My mother has an attorney. Since when?" Walter looked at him steadily. "Since before you were running your own business, Edward. I also represented your father. You would have known that if you had ever thought to ask." He opened the briefcase and removed a document, holding it up so that anyone in the front half of the room could see the header. "This is the deed to the property we are standing in right now. The name on this deed is Margaret Eleanor Hayes. There has been no transfer of ownership, no legal conveyance of any kind. Your parents have been living in this house for 11 years as guests, not owners. Massachusetts law takes a serious view of individuals who represent another person's property as their own, particularly when that property is used as leverage in business dealings. Across the room, I watched Mr. Clifford lean toward his son and say something in a voice too low to hear. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man looking at his partner. It was the expression of a man recalculating. Walter pulled a second document from the briefcase. 5 years ago, Margaret Hayes established a private trust, independent of her will, designed specifically to protect her assets in the event of financial misconduct by family members. He paused, and then he looked directly at me. The sole beneficiary of that trust, the house, the accounts, and the 1905 Bosendorfer piano, is Caroline Margaret Hayes. Sophia's voice cut through the room like a blade. That is fraud. My father stepped forward. She was manipulated. Caroline pushed her into. Walter raised one hand, just slightly, and my father stopped. I would encourage you to think carefully before finishing that sentence. There are 35 people in this room. Then, without changing his tone, Walter continued. The $112,000 obtained from the unauthorized sale of trust property must be returned within 30 days. Failure to do so will result in civil litigation. Given the documentation we have, I would not recommend testing that outcome. He glanced toward the window, where the Range Rover sat in the driveway, with its red bow still intact. I would suggest that asset be the first thing you consider liquidating. Sophia turned to Ryan with tears already forming. Ryan looked at the floor. My father turned to me then, and his face was something I had never seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but the particular ugliness of a man who has been exposed. You did this, he said. You poisoned her against us. I took one step forward. My voice, when it came, was steadier than I expected. No. Grandma made these decisions 5 years ago. I found out about them this week. My mother said, "You have always been jealous of your sister." And something in me went very quiet and very clear. I am not the one who sold her piano without asking. I am not the one who said, in a hospital hallway, that I was at least useful for something. And I am not the one who told me that if my grandmother died from the shock of learning the truth, it would be my fault. The room held its breath. Aunt Ruth placed her hand on my shoulder. I kept my eyes on my parents and I said, I have been invisible in this family for 29 years. I accepted it because I thought that was what love required. But Grandma taught me something different. She taught me that loving yourself means standing up for what is right, even when the cost is everything you thought you had. I paused, and then I said the words I had never once allowed myself to say out loud before. I will not apologize for this. Not now. Not ever again. The room stayed silent for a long moment after that. Then, slowly, people began to look away. The guests drifted out in ones and twos, murmuring quiet goodbyes, avoiding eye contact with my parents. I stood alone in the corner of the living room, right where that piano used to be, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel the need to make myself smaller to fit the space around me. The last guests filtered out slowly, leaving behind half-empty glasses and the particular silence that follows something that cannot be taken back. Walter found me still standing in the corner of the living room and spoke quietly so only I could hear. Legally, you have every right to ask them to leave tonight. I can have the paperwork drawn up before the week is out. I looked through the window. My father was sitting on the porch steps outside, shoulders collapsed forward, hands hanging between his knees. A man who had spent his entire life measuring his worth in square footage and business deals, now sitting on a porch that had never belonged to him, looking like someone had removed the floor beneath everything he thought he owned. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see my mother standing at the counter, staring out at the backyard garden, mascara streaked down both cheeks, not crying exactly, just standing very still, like a person who has forgotten who they are without an audience. I turned back to Walter and said, I don't want to do that. He looked at me with something close to surprise. I told him what I wanted instead. 90 days to return the $112,000, not 30. Enough time to sell the car and sort out their finances. A formal lease agreement at a minimal rate so they could stay in the house. And after my grandmother passed, 12 full months before they needed to find somewhere else. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Margaret told me you would respond this way. His voice had dropped to something warmer. She is very proud of you, Caroline. My father signed the agreement without once looking at my face. My mother's hand shook so badly she had to attempt her signature twice. Mr. Clifford and Ryan left without saying goodbye to anyone. Sophia sat alone in the passenger seat of the Range Rover for a long time, the red bow still on the hood, the engine off. It didn't look like a prize anymore. It looked like evidence. The room was nearly empty when my phone buzzed on the windowsill. A video call from the hospice number. I answered it, and my grandmother's face appeared on the screen. Pale, paper thin, but her eyes were warm and fully present, and behind her, I could see her nurse Carol standing near the doorway, smiling softly. "My brave girl," my grandmother said, her voice reduced now to something just above a breath. "How do you feel?" I looked at the corner of the room. The potted plant had been moved aside, and all that remained was the rectangular depression in the carpet, where the Bosendorfer had stood for 30 years. I said scared, and relieved, and sad, all at the same time. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. That is exactly what courage feels like. It has never once felt comfortable. I pressed my hand flat against the screen. On her end, she lifted hers and held it to the glass. "Just live well," she said. "Play music, be happy, that is how you thank me." I said, "I will, Grandma, I promise." She smiled at that, small, complete, and then the call ended, and I stood alone in the quiet of her living room, holding a phone that had gone dark. 3 weeks later, the hospice called at 5:47 in the morning. It was Carol's voice, gentle as fog. "She's been asking for you. You should come now." I drove through empty streets in the dark, the city still asleep around me, my heart keeping its own slow, heavy time. Her room smelled of lavender, same as always. She had insisted on it until the very end. The lamp on the nightstand cast a low gold light across the bed. She was awake when I came in, and she turned her head toward me the moment I stepped through the door. I sat beside her and took both her hands in mine. Her fingers were cold, but she held on with a grip that surprised me. "I'm sorry," she said, so quietly I had to lean close. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you sooner. I waited too long." I shook my head and told her the truth. "You gave me everything that mattered. Music, the knowledge that I was worth something. No one can take those things away from me." She smiled then, and it was the same smile from the photograph on my bookshelf, full of something lit from the inside. "Tired now, sweetheart," she whispered. "Stay with me," I said. "I'm right here, I'm not going anywhere." Margaret Hayes passed away peacefully as the first light of morning reached the window, her hand in mine. The consequences that followed came without drama, the way most true things do. Mr. Clifford called my father 2 weeks after the party and told him plainly that he could not do business with someone he was unable to trust, that if a man could deceive his own mother, he could deceive anyone. The joint venture, worth over $220,000, was finished. Sophia returned the Range Rover to the dealership, where they offered her $93,000, nearly $20,000 less than had been paid. She argued with the salesperson for the better part of an hour before she signed. Ryan sent her a 2-line text message 4 days after the party. My mother quietly transferred her memberships to a social club in a different part of the city, somewhere no one knew the family's history. My father's business contracted steadily over the following months, quieter now, smaller, stripped of the borrowed credibility that had propped it up for years. The funeral was held at the small church my grandmother had attended for 50 years. She had asked for simplicity, no elaborate arrangements, no performance of grief. I sat down at the old upright piano near the front of the sanctuary and played a classical nocturne in E-flat that she had taught me when I was 7 years old, the very first piece she ever put in front of me. The notes moved through the stillness of that room slowly, unhurried, and I heard someone in the middle pews draw a quiet breath and hold it. Aunt Ruth sat in the front row with a crumpled handkerchief in both hands. Old friends of my grandmother's, from her performing years, filled several pews behind her, white-haired women who remembered when Margaret Hayes's name had meant something on a concert stage. My parents sat in the very last row. My mother wore a wide-brimmed black hat pulled low. My father stared straight ahead at the altar, with the expression of a man attending his own sentencing. After the service ended and people began to make their way toward the doors, I saw my father stand. He took one step toward me, then another, then a third, and stopped. My mother placed her hand on his arm, very lightly, and he turned and walked with her out the side door without looking back. I stood and watched him go. Maybe he had wanted to say something, maybe not. I realized, standing in that quiet church, that I no longer needed to know. 6 months after the funeral, I moved into the house in Concord. I used part of the returned money to buy a Yamaha grand piano, and I placed it in the corner of the living room where the Bosendorfer had stood. Different instrument, different story, but the same corner, and that felt right. My first student was a 7-year-old named Emma, Aunt Ruth's granddaughter, with wide eyes and fingers so small she could barely reach an octave. The first time she played a complete scale without stopping, she looked up at me and asked, "Did I do it right?" I nodded, and then I had to look away for a moment because my eyes had filled. My parents moved out before the 12 months were up. My mother said she couldn't live somewhere with so many difficult memories. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I simply held the door. 8 months after the funeral, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. It was Sophia. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Not soft exactly, but smaller, like something had been taken out of it. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," she said. "I just wanted to say something." She told me she was working an entry-level job at a marketing firm, taking the bus, seeing a therapist twice a week. "My therapist says I have a lot to work through about Mom and Dad, about how I was raised." She paused. "Turns out being the favorite isn't actually a gift. It's a trap." I told her that our grandmother had loved her too, that the choices she made were never about love, only about what she could and couldn't reward. Sophia said quietly, "I know that now." I told her that if she ever wanted to talk, I was willing to listen, but that trust takes time to rebuild, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. We hung up without saying goodbye, not out of coldness, but because neither of us quite knew how. And sometimes, not knowing how, is still a beginning. It is evening now, almost exactly a year since the day my grandmother was admitted to hospice. I am sitting at the piano as the sun goes down, the windows open, the smell of jasmine drifting in from the garden she planted 20 years ago. The light is the color of honey. I play slowly, no hurry, letting the music find its own pace. On top of the piano sits a photograph, my grandmother at 60, fingers resting on the keys, eyes lit by something that had nothing to do with the camera. I look at her and I say, out loud, in the quiet of a room that is now mine, "I'm okay, Grandma, more than okay. I don't have the Bosendorfer. I don't have the family I once thought I had, but I have something that cannot be sold, cannot be transferred, cannot be taken without my permission. I have myself. I have the truth I chose to tell. I have a life built on something real. That is what she left me. That is the only inheritance that ever mattered."